Hey everyone, welcome to this revision video about Helmsley Castle, history around us topic. We're looking at Helmsley Castle since 1700. We're talking about Duncombe Park, the romantic ruin, and Helmsley Castle being a tourist and heritage site in the 20th and 21st century as well. So here we go. Okay, so let's find out about Helmsley Castle and Duncombe Park. So as we've found out about, an Act of Parliament in 1689 allowed the Helmsley Castle estate to be sold to settle George Villiers II's debts. And the London banker called Charles Duncombe, who had been Mayor of London, of course, purchased Helmsley and its 40,000 acre estate for £90,000. Now, he didn't really do much with Helmsley Castle, but he left the estate to his brother-in-law and business partner, Thomas Brown, who changed his name to Thomas Duncombe, and he decided to build a new residence rather than live in the castle, presumably because it had fallen into ruin after the slighting of the East Tower and having been neglected by George Villiers II. So Duncombe Park gets created and Helmsley Castle's role shifts in the 18th century and it becomes a romantic backdrop for Duncombe Park. A walled garden is established in 1758 and Thomas's grandson William Duncombe, who was Lord Feversham, made extensive alterations to Duncombe Park in 1843 and 1847. There were actually two separate fires which devastated the house at Duncombe Park in 1879 and 1895, but that gives us a little bit of background about what was happening to the estate during this time. So Helmsley Castle goes through another change of use. Remember, we've had it sort of military use, religious use. We've talked about how it's been used for more domestic purposes and lived in the 14th century, the Tudor mansion into the 16th century, and then the 17th century with the sort of military turning point of the English Civil War. Well, in the 18th and 19th century, the castle changes its use again. It's now a ruin. The castle becomes a romantic ruin in the 18th century. Artists such as J.M.W. Turner sketch Helmsley Castle, and we'll have a look at some of those sketches in a moment. By the 19th century, the area between the Southwest Range and the East Tower had been levelled and raised to make a lawn tennis court and house a chicken run. The ground, we know the ground was higher up at this time because a ring for tethering a horse can be seen high up the latrine tower, showing how high the ground was at this time compared to now. Parish events were held there at the castle, arranged by people like Charles Norris Gray, who was Vicar of Helmsley. This included fetes, historical pageants, agricultural shows, tennis tournaments. In 1876, the 10th North Riding of Yorkshire Rifle Volunteer Company drilled at the castle. Political demonstrations took place at the castle in the late 19th century, such as the Primrose League, who were a conservative organisation in the grounds of the castle. So we can see here a picture of Helmsley Castle just behind actual Duncombe Park and Duncombe House. You can see that idea of the romantic ruin. And here we can see Thomas Girton painting a picture of Helmsley Castle as this romantic ruin. You know, you've got the slighted East Tower there, for example. And this was a really sort of common idea of Helmsley Castle. And really common in the 19th century. It's quite fashionable for people to have what were called follies, which were like old castles in their gardens. The sort of idea of Gothic architecture was really popular in the 19th century, which is when buildings were made to look like old castles. So from the point of view of the Duncombe's, they had their own folly, a real kind of castle in their grounds to their home. So this would be a talking point, then this would be something to show off as part of their estate. Now, thinking about the use of Helmsley Castle, we've got a photograph of children from Helmsley from the Wesleyan Day School taking part in a pageant at the castle in April 1900. Here you've got a picture of the tennis court, so you can see here that you've got the old West Tower and the West Range and the latrine tower, which is covered with trees and plants at that time. So you can see that inner bailey there, and the land was a lot higher, so in the 20th century that land had to be dug back down again to expose the footings of the various buildings. So this was taken in the early 20th century before clearance of the site. Here you can see another picture of the East Tower and the tennis court, which was very much in that bailey area between the East Tower and the West Tower during that time. Here we can see a pageant going on in 1898 with a Tudor mansion in the background. And here we can see a political meeting of the Primrose League at Helmsley Castle that took place around about 1898. So again, the grounds there being used by the local community. Now, at the start of the 20th century, little was left of the Tudor house. The latrine tower was roofless, and the medieval ruins were covered in ivy and trees were growing in the ditches in the interior. So it was a real mess. So you can see there's the South Barbican with some sheep just grazing inside it, very much overgrown. The castle kind of can hardly be seen because of all the growth not being conserved at all whatsoever. And that other picture in the bottom left hand corner shows the restoration work. You can already see that some of the ground has been lowered to expose the footings of some of the old walls, for example. So Asbestos Wall, for example, down there just near the West Tower. So you can see some of those remains of the castle. And this is all about the heritage kind of purpose of the castle. So one of the first custodians of the castle in the 20th century was Tom Dale, and he occupied a hut inside the double gates, and he'd served with Lord Feversham on the Western Front, and his association with the family led to his appointment after World War I, and he worked at Helmsley until 1947. Now in 1923, the Office of Works, which was a government organisation, took responsibility for the castle. Now this became English heritage in around about 1983-84, and a real key individual was a man called Sir Charles Piers, who was the Chief Inspector of Ancient Monuments, and he tackled the works at Helmsley Castle and organised the restoration work of Helmsley Castle, including the clearing of the castle of debris, including still some debris from the East Tower, emptying rubble from the ditches which had been there since the English Civil War, consolidating the ruins, giving a new roof to the latrine tower, building 4 timber bridges to provide safe public access, which we still use to access the castle nowadays. Now, during the Great Depression of the early 1930s, and again, there's another top tip for writing about diversity here, unemployed labourers were engaged and employed to dig and reform the ditches and ramparts, filling in the gap at the southwest corner of the outer rampart using cleared materials, and lots of archaeological finds were discovered, and some are now kept in the Castle Museum, and some are in the Helmsley Archaeological Store. Now, during World War II, the Ministry of Works turned Duncombe Park's grounds into a military camp, and the earthworks at Helmsley Castle were ideal as an anti-tank measure, and they were going to be used as part of a defensive network planning for a potential Nazi invasion of Britain. So again, we've got that military use of Helmsley Castle site that comes back in during World War II. Thankfully, it never had to be used, but again, a reminder about how national events could impact and therefore could create changes in use. Now in 1957, the remains of the brew house and the bakehouse in the northwest corner of the site were cleared, and in 1985, when the area to the north of the castle was designated a car park, an excavation revealed a watercourse and some earth banks which may have been part of their medieval gardens. Now, the castle passed to English heritage in 1984. In the 1990s, 3 medieval warriors were placed outside the South Barbican, and the visitor centre was built in 2004. Now, the purpose of the castle now is for conservation, for heritage. It's a tourist attraction for the town of Helmsley. The West Range, the old Tudor mansion, now houses an educational museum. So you've just revised some of the main uses of Helmsley Castle in the 20th century. It's about providing work for unemployed labourers during the Great Depression. Archaeological finds were discovered in the 1930s and now housed inside the Tudor mansion in the museum. The military purpose during World War II, with the earthworks of Helmsley Castle being seen as an ideal anti-tank measure. People from the town have been employed by the castle. The castle brings people to Helmsley as a tourist attraction, and we even get things like Civil War reenactments taking place. And we've just taken that screenshot from the website, which again shows those 3 warriors that were built in the 1990s, and you can see that the castle and the museum itself makes a lot of emphasis on the military history of the castle and also its links with the English Civil War. So that's just a reminder, the castle has been used for historical reenactments, and we can see here the sealed knot reenactment taking place at Helmsley Castle. So again, that gives you another idea for some of the uses and purposes of Helmsley Castle in the more modern era. Okay, so that completes our work on thinking about the last different stages of Helmsley Castle. So looking at Helmsley Castle since 1700s, we've covered that different information in the grey boxes there in terms of the people associated with the castle. Much more diverse use since 1700, lots of different range of people getting involved in the castle, owning the castle, and obviously a huge shift in the sort of change in purpose of the castle from being owned by the Lords of Helmsley and projecting power over the town to becoming a facility for the town, and also a facility that brings jobs and tourism into the town of Helmsley as well. Okay, thanks for listening. Bye bye.